Hi everyone, this is Miss Richardson and I am checking in for a tutorial video on snake eyes. So this program is a little complicated and challenging, so I wanted to go over it with you guys and how you might approach solving this particular problem. So it starts off with the instructions saying write a program that rolls 2 dice until the computer gets snake eyes. You should use a loop and a half to do this. Each round you should roll 2 dice with a randomizer and print out their values. If the values on both dice are 1, then it's called snake eyes and you should break out of the loop. You should also use a variable to keep track of how many rolls it takes to get snake eyes. So it should look something like this. So you can see where it's going to print out those random numbers. And then right here, this is probably our variable holding our value. So let's go ahead and switch over to our planning. All right, so before I start building my program, I'm going to come up with a plan for what I want my program to actually do. Now, while loops and loops and a half can be a little bit tricky, you have to think about what is going to go inside your loop, what comes before, and then what comes after. So I'm going to start off with what I know I want my loop to repeat. I know that I want to randomly generate a dice each time. So I'm going to put those inside my loop. So my random dice rolls are actually going to go inside my loop. So I'm going to need it for 2 dice. So dice 1 and dice 2. I also know that I'm going to be checking the value of those dice each time. I know that if they are the same, that's going to be my break statement that I use. So that's going to be where I break out of the loop. Else, it's going to continue to repeat. Now, I'm also going to need to keep track of how many times I roll. So this is actually going to represent something I do before. Before my loop happens, I need to create an accumulator variable. Now, if you remember from some of our past videos, an accumulator variable is something that you set before your loop begins. You just set it to 0, and as your loop runs, you're going to change it. So I'm typically do this right here at the beginning. I'm going to keep track of my rolls right at the start. So I'm going to add something to my rolls every time this runs. And then after, we're going to need some type of message that refers to the number of rolls that it took. So it's going to call back my accumulator here. So message for roll count. So I'm going to switch back to my program editor and I'm going to start planning out my 3 sections. So the first section is going to be before my loop begins. My middle section is going to be the while loop itself. And my last section is going to be after the loop ends. So from my plan before the loop begins, I'm going to create an accumulator variable. So I'm just going to go var, and I'm just going to call it roll count because it's the number of times that we are rolling the dice. And I'm just going to initialize that to 0 to start off with. Since we don't have any to begin with, we're just going to set it at 0. And I do recommend with an accumulator, you set it to something, either 1 or 0, depending on what you're doing. Since we're just adding, we're going to set it to 0. All right. So now let's start my while loop. Now, this is the type of while loop where you can just set this to true because we have a break statement inside of our loop to end it. So we don't have to worry about setting any type of condition here. It's just going to run until we do something. Now, if I go back to my plan, I'm going to add something to my rolls to keep the fact that we're rolling. I'm going to randomly roll dice 1 and dice 2, and then I'm going to check it with an if statement. So we'll do roll count plus plus, because as soon as I enter my while loop, it's counting a roll. And now I'm going to roll 2 dice. I'm going to do var dice 1. And I'm going to use my randomizer, randomizer.nextInt. Dice typically have 6 sides. The number is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I'm going to do that for another dice. I'm going to do dice 2. Randomizer, sorry, I spelled that wrong. There we go. Next int. And so that is going to actually be the dice rolls that we're seeing here. So that's going to generate those two numbers. Now, every time this loop runs, we want to print what we rolled. So we're going to do a print line statement. And we're just going to say rolled like that. And then I'm going to call dice number 1. And I'm going to add a space between my two dice, because if I look at my example, there's a space in the middle there. And I will call dice 2. So now it's going to randomly generate dice 1, randomly generate dice 2, and now it's going to roll them or print what I rolled. Then we need to do our check, right? We need to see whether or not I rolled doubles. So I'm going to set up an if-else statement. So an if checks a Boolean expression. So if dice 1 equaled the value of 1 and dice 2 equaled the value of 1. That's the thing that I'm going to be checking, because I want to roll snake eyes. So I'm not just checking that I rolled doubles this time. I'm actually checking for snake eyes. So dice 1 has to equal the value of 1 exactly. And then I'm using my logical operator to control and saying dice 1 and dice 2 both have to be these things. And then I'm going to set dice 2 is equal to the value of 1. So I have two Boolean checks here. I'm combining them with a logical operator. Now, if those are the same, that is going to end. Let me make sure I close my curly brace there. That is going to end this particular loop. So here is where I'm going to use the break statement. Now, this particular program is not going to use an else. Because we are in a while loop, the else would be to roll again, which it already does simply by ending. So I'm just going to go ahead and end my if statement there, and we're going to exit our while loop because it's done everything that our plan needed. We kept track of our rolls, we randomly chose dice 1 and dice 2, and we set up our if statement. We ended up not needing that else. Now, after our while loop, we're going to print a message of how many rolls it took. Now, in the example, it says it took you blank rolls to get snake eyes. So I'm going to set up a print line statement. I'm going to start off with it took you, and then I'm going to put in the roll count variable. There's a reason we've been using this roll count variable. It keeps track of how many times it runs. So it took you blank roll count rolls to get snake eyes. I'm going to reread through my directions, make sure I hit everything. Roll 2 dice until you get snake eyes. Use a loop and a half. So there's that break statement that makes it a loop and a half. We rolled 2 dice with a randomizer. We printed out their values. If both the dice are set to 1, it breaks out of the loop. And it gives a message on how many times it took to get snake eyes. So I'm going to do a run test, see if I get any syntax issues. I do not. And here is my first run. So you can see this looks like my model. It says rolled. There's random dice 1, random dice 2. They did not match, and they were not snake eyes, so it rolled again, and it kept going, and it kept going. And then finally here you can see rolled 1, 1, and it took you 41 rolls to get snake eyes. I'm going to check my code. And I got all green check marks. If you have any further questions with snake eyes, please let me know. Or if you get your program and you think it looks exactly the same and you're still getting error messages, take a screenshot, email it to me, and see if I can help you identify where your error is. Have fun, guys, and I hope that this video was helpful.